I'm asking, why is this important? In asking this question, I would like to show you several reasons why this is important. First, in terms of world member data, Africa's production of research is relatively weak. If you look at this, you'd see Africa is more or less like a malnourished child who has been suffering from kwashiorkor and other things. And we have to think about why is this the case? If you compare to research productivity in other continents, it is quite high, and Africa is relatively weak. There are many reasons why this is the case, and I don't intend to answer this question. I just want to raise this as a question that may be interrogated as we move on. The second thing is that part of what we know as an enabler to learning is access to power, in such a way that people are able to read and prepare themselves anytime they want. And access to electricity in homes in Africa, as you can see there, is weak. What it means is that people only have access are able to only study when they are in institutions of learning, whether it is in school or in universities, but not at home. And part of this reason is, as you may have seen some data from other sources, is that African learners and students stay relatively lower numbers of hours in school. Whereas in some places, students would be from 8 to 5. In Africa, that number is much, much lower. It's maybe from 7:30 to 1. And it affects how education is conducted in its results. Second, the third thing is that the percentage of Africans who can read compared to the world average is much lower than the world average. The world average is 86% of literacy. And in most African countries, as you can see there, is lower than average. Here, I would just like to clarify, you may say, why is Matengu concerned about literacy? We are higher education, we are not responsible for basic education. In my opinion, we are. We produce the teachers who teach in basic education. And so it is important for us that we think about what is going on and what we're going to do about that. Because we have got to cause development and cause the interest that we want to see in higher education, in basic and see education as a system. How is Africa doing as far as ranking is concerned? Again, you can see that the percentage of universities that are ranked in Africa is relatively low. And there are many reasons around this. I know there's controversy about the process of ranking itself and the business interests of the publishers and many other things. But this is the reality as far as ranking is concerned. Africa is not doing well. There is some sort of relation between ranking and the economy and access to electricity. If you take more or less any satellite image around 11 or 12 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the world will look like this. If you compare the institutions that are ranked and where energy is, you will see a relationship, isn't it? You see where most of the universities are ranked and its relation to economy, the strength of the economy, as well as access to electricity. Most of Africa is relatively dark. Why is this? Then, what is the impact of research on hunger and vulnerability? You can also see two things you can observe in this map is that Africa, the percentage of people who have extreme vulnerability to hunger is very high in Africa, Where it shows no data is not necessarily that there isn't data. It is because people there are not vulnerable to hunger and other aspects. And again, it is summoning higher education. If we have the best brains, what can we do about this? The average of income to people in extreme poverty. Again, you can see there are questions of how do we allocate resources and how is this impacting on the level of income. Basically, the thing here is that if you raise the middle class, you are attacking poverty. If you have a high number of low class and higher class, you have a huge population in between that is vulnerable and marginal in terms of what you could do in terms of poverty. According to data, in the next 3 generations, Africa will make up 41% of the world's youth. Africa is what 1.7 to close to 2 billion people, and the majority of that are youth. As far as I've seen, is around about 800 million who are youth in Africa. And how are we preparing them to make sure that they get into education? So we know that the percentage of Africans in education compared to the rest of the world is still very low. And here I must tell you some interesting statistics. In that out of the 54, depending what you consider, maybe 55 African countries, the gross tertiary enrollment in higher education is around about 9.4%, which is below the global average of 38%. It tells you that there is something that is happening that is either hindering or not empowering people to get into higher education. Overall, the spending per region is 21% of government education expenditure on tertiary education compared to 27% on secondary education and 43% on primary education. Basically, the majority of funding in higher education in Africa is going to basic education, less so to secondary and to higher education. Across the continent, approximately 9 million students are enrolled in tertiary education sector, which is 3% of the total enrollment. Now, if you think about the number of Africans that are not in higher education compared to the rest of the world, you can see there that again is a huge number of people who do not access higher education for various reasons: funding, infrastructure, capacity, and so on. You can twist this and get a different map that shows you the number of people who do not access higher, who do not complete higher, basic secondary school. That is also a very interesting picture you will get. In the interest of time, I didn't include this map, but it will give you a perspective of what actually is happening in African education. Has Africa contributed to Nobel laureates? Does anyone know one? There are some, but there are some in Egypt and several other places, but you can see there that again, the contribution of Africa as a continent to Nobel laureates is very, very low. Actual enrollment in higher education, you can see there across the other regions. Sub-Saharan Africa is on the bottom. Even in the Middle East and North Africa is not doing that well. The question is why? In terms of the percentage of those enrolled in higher education compared to total enrollment per country, you will see there that there is also very interesting statistics that we can interpret in different ways. Again, is this something that is telling us about the quality of education, the hindrances to access, how it is funded, the norms and standards that should be in place? How about spending? Is that the big question? As I indicated earlier, the majority of the funds goes to basic education followed by secondary education, and what remains is what goes to higher education. And you can compare this map to ranking, to economy, to research productivity. You can see the relationship. Therefore, advancing excellency in higher education is important. And this is why the 6 themes of this conference are strategic. There are some good things that are happening in other African countries. That is why you see that small cloud in the end of the map of something that is happening in Africa, which we must share. That is good practice. It's something that is happening there, which we are not sharing. We need to share more. Part of this is what to do about doctoral education. I have seen figures. The world estimate is that around about 100 million people by 2030 would be doing their PhDs in universities. That figure is expected to increase to about 600 million in 2065. The question is, how much of those would be Africans and studying in Africa? And it begs the question of how many centers of African studies do you find in Africa? You find many of them outside Africa, but not in Africa itself. Or let's say, how many do we have centers of European or Asian studies in Africa? We don't find this. But doctoral education and postdoctoral education are key ways of resolving the issues that you see in the maps that I've indicated.